welcome everybody. It's great that you've joined us for our second Legends and Legacies meeting. This time we're talking about academics, scientists, doctors, etc. And it's great to have Mark with us. Mark Wade, the creator and producer of Legends and Legacies, was born in Durban, French Mauritian and South African parents, studied art and design in Durban, and then filmmaking in Los Angeles. Started his film career at the studio of Kurtz and Friends, one of Hollywood's leading independent animation studios in the 70s, and then progressed to being an art director and assistant director on numerous films, TV series, and TV commercials. Creating Legends and Legacies was his first venture in producing, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that. And Alan Swerdlow, who is really sorry he can't be with us because he's laid up with several misplaced discs in his back. He's a Joburger and completed his postgraduate studies at the University of Cape Town's Little Theatre, has acted, written, and directed for most of the theatrical managements in South Africa, is one of the most highly acclaimed theatre directors in South Africa, and a theatre historian. And he was a member of the Market Theatre and put that on the, putting it on the road to world recognition. And from there, moved to the Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal, South African Broadcasting Corporation, and Peter Turian's company as one of his principal directors. So now I'm going to mute everybody, and when it's time for asking questions, please raise your virtual hand if you can, because it helps me to see who wants to speak, and unmute yourself when you want to speak. So Mark, you'll also have to unmute yourself when I've muted everybody, and then I'm going to hand over to you to introduce this session and what it was like to produce Legends and Legacies.
By the time the Jews began arriving in the Cape Colony, they
were... Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm really grateful to be involved with the CHOL project. I think it's very, very interesting, and I've learned so much about the community that I really didn't know about. This project started as a kind of a little inspiration while I was having a shower, and just became a bigger and bigger project. I had no idea to what extent it was going to grow. Fortunately, I was able to, after 3 years of knocking on doors and trying to raise funding, I tracked down Nati Kirsch, who very kindly funded the entire project. And as I said, after years trying to find any money, no one was interested at all. And then really fortunate to be introduced to Alan Swerdlow by Kathy Kaler from Chai FM Radio in South Africa. Kathy allowed me to run a radio program once a week on Chai. And prior to me raising the money, and for one episode, I was looking for someone from theatre, and she asked me if I knew Alan, and I said no. And she made the introduction, and when I chatted to him, he said he wants to come on board. So I was really, really fortunate to find him. I don't think the project would have been anywhere near the success it was without him. And then he started off, he wanted to be the creative director, and then he ended up being the researcher, followed by the writer, and followed by the presenter. So the two of us worked together really closely from the early days. It was actually quite interesting sitting in this little office together and developing the story, where we had this room full of little yellow stickies all over the wall. As we developed an idea, we wrote it down, the sticky, and stuck it in the wall, and then it was putting together this massive jigsaw puzzle into 8 episodes. So each episode is not running chronologically. We've actually themed each episode. So, the first episode is who were they, where did they come from, and then we go to how they got involved with the communities, and then their outreach programs, who they were, the revolutionaries, the activists, then on to the academics and the theologians, which we're going to be doing in this episode. And the next episode, episode 7, really is the artists, the entertainers, the dancers, musicians. So that's going to be really, really interesting to look at. Episode 8, we're a little bit saddened about because it was filmed probably 2.5 years ago. And so much has happened since. So although it was a reflection on the present and future, I sadly think so much of that has changed. So to start off, we're going to skip the what's called the cold introduction and the title sequence and go straight into Alan talking about essentially the being mindful. It's the Jewish capability and the need to be educated and to learn.
The great Russian cities. After the revolution, higher education was available to all deemed suitable, even women, as Russia attempted to industrialize swiftly to catch up with the rest of the Western world.
Though there were some educated professionals who arrived as part of the second wave of immigration into South Africa, the majority were laborers, tradesmen, some specialized craftsmen, and if they were enterprising enough and had a little capital to begin their ventures, businessmen. The reality that confronted many of the new arrivals is that no matter how willing they were to do basic manual labor, the existence of a much cheaper pool of workers from the indigenous population and the de facto institution of a color bar meant that the immigrants were forced to aim higher. The same aspirational drive that moved the Jewish population from Fordsburg to Sandton and District 6 to Constantia also propelled proud, if somewhat bewildered parents to attend graduation ceremonies where they could truly declaim, "Mein Sohn, the doctor."
It's worth noting that the first real expressions of academic study and research in the community came from the rabbis. The early community leaders were highly educated. Consider Reverend Alfred Bender, who ministered to the Cape Town Hebrew congregation from 1895 onwards, was Cambridge University educated at St. John's College, and he arrived in South Africa with an MA. The following year, in addition to his synagogue and community duties, he was appointed to the chair of Hebrew at the South African College and was also appointed to serve as the governor's personal representative on the council of the University of the Cape of Good Hope. In his published collection, 2 volumes of his sermons, Bender could refer to or quote from Heinrich Heine and Maurice Maeterlinck, all for a Friday evening homily or drosha. Bender's predecessor was the Reverend Joel Rabinowitz, who had been a research worker in Oxford University's Bodleian Library. During his ministry in the Cape, he often contributed to the British Jewish press, whether accounts of the life of the community or appeals for assistance to ameliorate community needs. When he retired from his position at the synagogue, he studied a little further, moved to the gold fields of the Witwatersrand, and became a gold assayer and opened a laboratory. One of the most acclaimed thinker-writer rabbis of South Africa was Johannesburg Chief Rabbi Judah Landau. Born in Galicia, he was educated at the University of Vienna, which granted him a doctorate for his comparison between Hebrew views. He was welcomed back to the Transvaal after the Anglo-Boer War by Milner, and whilst serving as rabbi to the Witwatersrand Hebrew congregation, he was also professor of philosophy at the Transvaal University College, which subsequently became the University of the Witwatersrand. Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz we already know as an outspoken critic of the policies of the nationalist government in South Africa. In addition to his spiritual duties as chief rabbi and head of the Beth Din in Johannesburg, Rabinowitz was also a noted historian and academic. He too was professor of Hebrew at Wits and published prolifically, everything from collections of his sermons to an analysis of the social life of Jews in northern France from the 12th to the 14th centuries. On retirement from his position as spiritual leader of the South African Jewry, he became deputy editor-in-chief of the monumental Encyclopedia Judaica. The two major universities in South Africa both sustained a department of Hebrew or Hebrew studies almost from inception. Earlier I mentioned some universities or colleges that claimed a Christian identity. Each of them had a department of religious studies or biblical analysis or Semitic languages or even biblical translation where Hebrew was studied, but invariably this was classical Hebrew or biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. Stellenbosch University, UCT's great rival, had a course in the quaintly termed Ancient Studies, which sounds more descriptive of its faculty members than its subject. UNISA, the distance learning university, had courses in Hebrew literature, including contemporary poetry, as well as modern Hebrew prose of its time. But the opportunities for such specific study mirrored the growth and diminishment of the South African Jewish community. Today, less than a handful of biblical studies courses are offered here, and mostly in the departments of theology that survive, none of them staffed with Jews. UNISA has phased out its Hebrew courses, and the departments of Hebrew that produced notable scholars of the language and literature at WITS and UCT no longer exist. Jewish studies can be pursued at various yeshivot and religious centers, of course, and at the occasional adult education class, but on an internationally recognized academic level, the Kaplan Center in Cape Town is now unique on the continent. From the arrival of the Litvaks, though, a parallel stream of intellectual debate and creativity flowed for a good few decades. The lingua franca of the Pale of Settlement was Yiddish, the melding of Hebrew and medieval German that had initially evolved amongst the Jews known as Ashkenazi. Those who maintained this wellspring of creativity, which took many forms, newspapers, essays, debate, poetry, history, creative writing, and the like, were known as Yiddishists and brought the tradition with them to South Africa. In addition, they brought with them the often heated workers' politics that had found their expression in the Bund. I've mentioned before the Yiddische Arbeiters Club, which for a good few decades provided a range of activities for the Yiddish-speaking population of Johannesburg. There were other clubs, associations, and reading circles which promoted intellectual discourse. In Cape Town, Benkenstad's bookshop in District 6 was a hive of activity outside of its commercial function. There were readings, debates, discussions, circles. In fact, Benkenstad functioned more like a university club than an ordinary bookseller. The number of books in Yiddish produced in South Africa is noteworthy, particularly when you consider the number of potential readers at the time. Interestingly, during the 20s, there were 2 printing works in Johannesburg, painstakingly hand-setting the commissions. But the process was so unreliable and uneconomical, some South African Yiddish writers chose to send their work back to Lithuania to be printed there.
Morris Hoffman and Hyman Polsky wrote short stories and sketches, as did Richard Feldman, who notably chronicled the relationship between the Jewish and black communities in his collection called Schwarz und Weiß. Joseph Sherman, who went on to teach Yiddish studies at Oxford University, wrote an autobiographical novel called Land von Gold und Sonnenschein, which was the first South African Yiddish novel.
The outpouring of poetry, in particular lyric poetry, was remarkably strong. Sarah Eisen in Cape Town wrote verses that expressed a woman's view of the South African experience. David Wolpe wrote poems and essays. Mendel Tabachnik wrote an epic 3-volume novel called Kalman Bullen, detailing the Jewish immigrant experience. The greatest of the South African Yiddish poets was probably David Fram.
Many of them were.
Just a quick introduction. This is Dr. Hazel Frankel, and she's a research associate at Wits University in the School of Literature, Language and Media, and she received her doctorate at Sheffield University.
Wanted to acculturate as quickly as possible, which meant learning either English or Afrikaans. Those who were in the platteland learned to speak to their workers there in a black language. Many of the literary focused immigrants in the beginning stuck to Yiddish, and Fram never wrote in English, ever. He was completely committed to Yiddish. That was his monument to his homeland, to his community, and he never wanted to change, and it actually prevented him from adapting easily. So he never really felt at home here. And even at the end of his life, he was still writing poetry about longing for home. So in the beginning, he writes a poem, Ich Bank, that he longs for his shtetl and the simple life that he left behind. And at the end, one of the last poems that he wrote was Oifat Dach, Hop geschwitzet as Schwalb. Once on a roof, a swallow twittered. And he remembered the landscape of Lithuania in that poem. At the same time that he wrote Ich Bank, he also wrote in an Afrikaner beginnen, in a South African dawn. And he describes the felt and the sounds that were different. The sun, it starts, Sizunik, it's sunny, couldn't believe it. And then goes on to describe the flora and the fauna, the hibiscus, the hydrangeas, the bright colors. Some of the poems are desperately sad, especially the ones that he wrote about the Holocaust, where he expresses the real loss of his family and that he wished almost that he'd been with them. And he imagines himself wearing the yellow badge and walking with them and walking with his parents to their fate. Lots of books that have come out now talk about Yiddish as a monument and a memorial, and that in Yiddish you can access the culture, not only the history, what they were like, what their lives were like before the war, not only to focus on the fact that they were destroyed, but what a rich community it was, intellectually, religiously, in the street, how they spoke to each other every day. And so it is a way to keep Jewish culture alive.
Jewish representation at universities across the country hadn't solely been associated with Jewish studies. Study at a tertiary level was part of the process of integration and stepping out of the shadow of immigration and bettering one's existence and that of the family too. Of course, the possibility of professional qualification was entirely dependent on family circumstances, and for a lengthy period, it was only the children of well-to-do Jewish families who could afford the costs.
There were bursaries within the community, as
Just to say that this is the old Hebrew school. The building stands in Yeovil. It's now virtually derelict.
well as state support, but assistance for the talented who had no other means was limited to a very small percentage of those who needed it. In the first half of the 20th century, academic study was not the automatic route to be followed, with trade and commerce being dominant instead. Many young Jews did not complete high school, having to join the workforce and help support the family. Since the 80s, though, the vast majority of Jewish matriculants have gone on to tertiary studies of some sort, even if the world of commerce was their ultimate destination.
These scenes here are shot at, as it says, the Adler Museum of Medicine at Wits University, where they've recreated an optician, a pharmacy, doctor's rooms, and just to give an idea what it was like historically.
What is it about Jews and medicine? On the one hand, there are endless variations of the jokes and stories about grandmothers ready to recount their litany of aches and pains at family gatherings, including suffering loudly in silence. On the other hand, Jewish involvement in the medical fields is a rich and lengthy history going back to Maimonides and earlier.
The Jewish contribution to the field of medical science, biology and physiology and physics in South Africa is more than noteworthy. No less than 3 Nobel Prize winners amongst them. This is not to denigrate the thousands of ordinary general practitioners that had many a mother quelling over their achievements and status, but let's consider a few of the internationally recognized men of science.
Solly Zuckerman was, unusually for the time, a second-generation South African, his grandparents on both sides having come to the Cape Colony from the Pale of Settlement. His high school education was at SACS, the South African College School, and he studied medicine at the University of Cape Town, becoming the very first recipient of a master's degree in anatomy awarded by UCT. After a stint at Yale University, he specialized at University College in London. Like Philip Tobias, he was an anatomist and worked at the London Zoological Society as a researcher. Later, he taught at Oxford and became a Fellow of the Royal Society. But it was during the Second World War that he entered the field for which he achieved his greatest fame. Because of his skills and his understanding of human anatomy, he was approached to serve as a researcher and advisor to the British government and the Royal Air Force.
Apart from designing a helmet for civilians, known as the Zuckerman helmet, he was the principal advisor to the armed forces on the effect of bombing. His advisory capacity didn't end with the end of the war, and he continued advising the British government on scientific matters right up until the 70s. He was an implacable supporter of nuclear disarmament and commented equally strongly on arms and the space race. He was knighted in 1956, promoted Knight Commander 8 years later, and appointed to the Order of Merit, and finally elevated to the peerage, styled Baron Zuckerman of Burnham Thorpe. Sir Aaron Klug was a classic example of the Litvak immigrant who made really good. Born in Zelvas in Lithuania, he came to South Africa as part of the last trickle of Litvaks with his parents in 1928. They settled in Durban, and Sir Aaron matriculated from Durban High School during the war years, moving on to study at Wits Medical School. Realizing that his interests were not medicine but science, he switched to the fields of physics, chemistry and mathematics, later obtaining his master's in the University of Cape Town's physics department. For his doctoral studies, he relocated to Trinity College, Cambridge. Since South Africa was still part of the British Commonwealth then, it was easier for someone as brilliant as Klug to obtain a place and a fellowship at so prestigious an institution. He won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1982 for his development of three-dimensional electron microscopy while researching at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, and became a director of the laboratory 4 years later. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth and elected President of the Royal Society. Cementing his South African identity, he became a member of the Order of Mapangubwe, presented to him by President Thabo Mbeki. Sir Aaron also maintained a strong connection with Israeli universities, and Ben Gurion University in Beersheba named their Center for Structural Biology after him.
Philip Tobias was probably South Africa's favorite academic. Genial, amenable, acutely witty and intellectually brilliant, he had the gift of explaining even the most arcane details of his chosen field, paleoanthropology, in such an accessible way that everyone could understand. Like Aaron Klug, he was a banana boy, born and educated in Durban. He too was a product of Durban High School, and after matriculation enrolled to study medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand. As a student, he became deeply involved in student affairs and politics and was the first chairman of the National Union of Students, NUSAS. Whilst completing his honours in histology and physiology, Tobias realised that his interests were less in being a general practitioner and more research inclined, and that is when he shifted his focus. With Professor Raymond Dart as his mentor, Tobias began to study anatomy, genetics, and anthropology. It's the town skull.
Further study abroad refined his focus, and he returned to this country to succeed his mentor as head of the Department of Anatomy and Human Biology. He worked with the Leakeys at Olduvai Gorge in Kenya and continued his exploration of hominid remains at Stokefontein Caves, and his reputation as one of the foremost paleoanthropologists in the world grew and grew. Subsequent appointments saw Philip become the Dean of Medicine and Head of Department, as well as the awarding of assorted professorships in a variety of fields. He published compulsively, lectured internationally, and taught his beloved students. All the while he railed against apartheid, countering eugenicists with sharply honed scientific responses, speaking out loudly and publicly against the government policies. A lecture he gave to the Union of Jewish Women in 1961 was entitled "The Meaning of Race," and so thoroughly demolished the ideologies of racism that it was subsequently published as an independent paper by the Institute of Race Relations.
He was thrice nominated for a Nobel Prize and won so many other awards he once ruefully joked that he no longer had space to display them, but would not think of moving from the Killarney apartment that was his personal sanctuary. When he died at the age of 86, among the many dignitaries who acted as pallbearers at his funeral at West Park Cemetery was former President Thabo Mbeki. The man was once described as South Africa's greatest scientific treasure, and the Yiddish word mensch was probably used more in his obituaries than for any other person. Like so many of his colleagues, Sidney Brenner was also the product of the middle period of Lithuanian immigration. His father was a cobbler working in Germiston, where Sidney was born in deprived circumstances, and legend has it he taught himself to read from the newspapers used to cover the table at mealtimes. He was educated at Germiston High School and immediately following, on receipt of a scholarship, at the University of the Witwatersrand.
He began studying the practices of medicine, but was only 15 when he began the course. And though age was not a restrictive factor for tertiary education in South Africa of the time, being licensed to practice medicine was. The faculty realized he would be too young to qualify once he had completed his course, and he was steered instead towards a Bachelor of Science degree in Anatomy and Physiology. Sidney continued studying at the university and eventually received a doctorate from Exeter College, Oxford University. Later studies took him to Berkeley in California. Like Aaron Klug, he also worked at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge. and during his time there, he was one of the first people to see Crick and Watson's theoretical model of the double helix structure of DNA. Though not a pioneer of molecular biology, Brenner advanced the field immeasurably, working all over the world. In San Diego, Okinawa, Singapore, who made him the first honorary citizen of that city-state, and other far-flung places, establishing laboratories and institutes. The recipient of multiple awards for his achievements, he became a Nobel laureate in 2002 for work in physiology or medicine, and the University of the Witwatersrand named their Institute for Molecular Bioscience the Sydney Brenner Institute in his honour.
In the field of surgery, the name Jack Penn stands out for the South African Jewish community, and not just because of the number of noses he reshaped. Penn became one of the most eminent reconstructive surgeons in the world. The title of his autobiography, The Right to Look Human, demonstrates the humanitarian principles that guided his work. Born in Cape Town, he relocated with his family to Johannesburg, was schooled at Parktown Boys High, and then enrolled at the Wits Medical School.
He became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons after furthering his studies in Edinburgh. After working at hospitals in both the United Kingdom and the USA, he returned to South Africa and lectured in clinical anatomy at Wits. At the start of the Second World War, he was sent to London, applying his plastic and reconstructive surgery skills for war casualties, especially fighter pilots injured in the Battle of Britain. Returning home, he founded and commanded the Brenthurst Military Hospital, set up in the home of Rand Lord Ernest Oppenheimer, who had loaned it for the war effort. Oppenheimer then endowed a chair of plastic, maxillofacial and oral surgery at Wits, and Penn was the first professor. He subsequently held various other professorships and academic positions all over the world. Because of his expertise in military reconstructive surgery, Penn was a key figure in the medical unit that went to Israel from South Africa during the 1948 War of Independence, and he also achieved lasting recognition for his work in Japan, helping survivors of the atomic blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Tokyo firestorm. He worked extensively in Africa, particularly at Lambarini at the invitation of Albert Schweitzer. Jack Penn had a creative side and won acclaim for his sculptures, particularly his busts of notable figures such as David Ben-Gurion. He also founded the first medical journal as a publishing forum for academic research on plastic surgery, and his clinic, named for the Brenthurst Military Hospital, still functions in Johannesburg.
Percy Amoyles manages to straddle a couple of fields like Jack Penn.
Just to interrupt again, we tried to interview Percy, and he was actually living in the UK, and he came to visit his family in South Africa. And when COVID broke out, he was actually locked down here and couldn't leave. And unfortunately, he didn't want us to interview him. He felt he was too old and frail to be on camera, which was quite sad.
He too was born in Johannesburg, educated at Wits University, and went on to further his studies in the UK and the USA. Prior to entering medical school, though, Amoyles spent a brief period studying mechanical engineering before deciding to switch the focus of his studies. He never really lost his initial inclination and skills, which paid off handsomely in his multiple inventions for his chosen field of ophthalmology.
Most notably, Amoyles developed the cryoprobe used for the cryo-extraction of cataracts in 1965, and the technique is still in use today for cataract surgery. In addition, he developed the rotary epithelial scrubber, No, that's not a Jewish mother down on all fours cleaning her doorstep or a child's ears, but a special brush used for a keratectomy. Another of his inventions, which has become standard in the procedure, is his diamond vitrectomy cutter, the specialized scalpel used to incise the correcting lines in the operation. Given the Jewish involvement in the diamond industry and mining in South Africa, it's nice to know that the gemstones aren't merely decorative. Though Percy treated many, many patients throughout his long career, one stands out in particular: Nelson Mandela. Amoyles was once called the man who made Mandela cry. No, he wasn't being villainous. Mandela's eyes and eyesight were affected by his years of hard labour in the limestone quarries of Robben Island, and Amoyles operated on the great man's tear ducts. In addition, Selig Persik Amoyles, to give him his full Jewish name, removed Mandela's cataracts using his cryoprobe.
The word Torah is often translated as instruction or law, both legal terms. The word for justice, tzedek, appears 43 times in the Torah. An entire book in the Tanakh is called Shoftim, judges. Is this the reason the legal profession is second only to medicine as a source of pride for Jewish parents, however cliched the notion might be? In the many contributions of Jews to South African society, there's a prevalence of significant Jewish individuals in the legal field.
Take, for example, Morris Kentridge and his son Sidney. Morris, son of Wolf Kantrovich, was born in Utjan, a shtetl in the northeast of Lithuania, where his father was the Chazan. The surname Kantrovich actually means a son of a cantor, so it appears to have been a chosen occupation within the family for some time. In 1887, the family relocated to Britain, where Papa Wolf took a position as a shochet and chazan, and Morris began his studies first at the University of St Andrews and later at the University of Glasgow, where he studied law after a brief flirtation with medicine. I think I'm reiterating my earlier point here. The family moved again to Vryheid in South Africa, and at some stage anglicised their name to Kentridge. After serving his articles, Morris was admitted to the bar in Durban, and he was elected to the Natal Provincial Council as the Labour Party member for Greyville. Soon afterwards, he became a member of the Union Parliament, this time standing in Durban Central. Lured to Johannesburg, he famously represented both Fordsburg and Troyville at differing stages. And subsequent to that, he crossed the floor to Smuts's South African Party, and when the SAP became the United Party, he was one of the core figures of the more liberal wing. Throughout, Morris Kentridge was involved in the affairs of the Jewish community and the Board of Deputies, and was an ardent Zionist. His son Sidney was born in Johannesburg and schooled at King Edward VII School, Kes, before studying at the University of the Witwatersrand. He served as an intelligence officer in East Africa during the Second World War, going on to complete his studies at Exeter College, Oxford, after the war's end. Whilst establishing his reputation, Sidney took on a series of cases deemed to have political consequences. He represented Solly Sachs's garment workers, was part of the defence team in the treason trial assisting Izzy Maisels, and he appeared for the families at the inquiry into the Sharpeville massacre. Most notably, he appeared for the family at the inquest into the death while in police custody of Black consciousness leader Steve Biko, where his incisive cross-questioning was so dazzling it was transmuted into a play and later a television drama where Albert Finney portrayed Kentridge.
It must be noted that the two state doctors who attended to Biko after his police assault, Ivor Lang and Benjamin Tucker, were both Jewish. They were subsequently disgraced in the post-apartheid South Africa, but it is indicative that the community wasn't and isn't necessarily a cohesive unit.
Kentridge's wife, Felicia, together with Arthur Chaskelson, co-founded the South African Legal Resources Centre, a non-profit organisation in support of justice and human rights, and Sydney served as one of the trustees. He returned to practice at the English bar until his retirement in 2013, taking silk as Queen's Counsel and eventually settling in London, though he served as an acting justice of the South African Constitutional Court in the mid-90s. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, and among his many other honours, the Sydney and Felicia Kentridge Award is given annually in their name by the South African Bar Council. Arthur Chaskelson graduated from Wits University and after serving his articles was admitted to the Johannesburg Bar in 1956. In 1963 he was part of the defence team in the Rivonia trial, the trial that ended with the sentencing of Nelson Mandela to imprisonment on Robben Island. Though he was a partner in a very successful legal practice, his commitment to human rights led him to establish the Legal Resources Centre together with Felicia Kentridge and Jeff Budlander, and he has served as the centre's director for 15 years. He was the first president of the South African Constitutional Court, and then, when the position received a new title, served as South Africa's first Chief Justice.
He was the recipient of many awards over the years, including the Justice Award from the Gruber Foundation at Yale and a Human Rights Award from the Jewish Board of Deputies. When he died in 2012, the South African flags over all national institutions were flown at half-mast in respect for his position as Chief Justice and his instrumental role in the development of the South African Constitution.
An interesting byline here that you can see that there's the South African jury have been from the early part of the 20th century really actively involved in social issues, especially the anti-apartheid movement and trade union movements, to the point that it was Lionel and Hilda Bernstein who drafted the Freedom Charter in 1955, which became the sort of framework of the Constitution that was drafted in 1994. And the Constitution really was active. There were many Jewish members on that, including, as Alan said, Arthur Chaskelson and Judge L.B. Sachs. So this goes back, there's really a direct line covering decades of Jewish involvement in social justice issues.
L.B. Sachs was born in Cape Town, the son of trade unionist Solly Sachs. In recounting his memories of growing up with his father, Sachs says he was the guy behind the newspaper. I saw the top of his head sticking out and his knees underneath.
On graduation, Sachs became an advocate defending those who were charged under the apartheid laws. He was an attendee of the Kliptown Congress of the People, where the Freedom Charter was signed. Albie was repeatedly arrested and served with banning orders and spent 166 days in solitary confinement under the notorious Detention Without Trial Act for his political activism. On his release, he elected to go into exile, initially in the UK, where he completed his PhD at Sussex University. Later, he moved back to the African continent as a law professor and researcher in Maputo in Mozambique, where in 1988 a bomb was placed under his car by the South African security forces. Sachs lost his right arm and the sight in one eye.
He began work with others, preparing a democratic constitution for the future new South Africa. In 1990, he returned home to serve on the Constitutional Committee in preparation for the country's transition to a constitutional democracy. He was appointed to the first Constitutional Court by President Nelson Mandela. where, in addition to his judicial duties, he was a key figure in the design of this constitutional court building in Johannesburg. In addition, he assembled the celebrated art collection that enhances the building.
Richard Goldstone is a third-generation South African with mixed English and Lithuanian ancestry. As a judge appointed to the Supreme Court bench, Goldstone brilliantly applied narrow definitions to subvert the apartheid laws, and he's credited with being more responsible than anyone else in bringing the Group Areas Act, the law that reserved residential occasions for whites only, to a complete standstill through his ruling on a specific case. After the 1994 transition of power, he was asked to be the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Though Mandela wished to appoint him to the new constitutional court, he was fully supportive of Goldstone as representative of newly democratic South Africa in international affairs. He was also appointed to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and became its chief prosecutor, serving both tribunals with distinction. Further appointments to other international commissions and committees followed, but when he was appointed to the UN fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict, it proved to be extremely divisive within the South African Jewish community, even though Goldstone's objectives were, as he said, deep concern for victims in all sides in the Middle East.
Richard Goldstone retired from the Constitutional Court of South Africa in 2003. Other positions he held included the Chancellorship of Wits University and being a governor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The multiple honors heaped upon him include the MacArthur Award.
I think what's characteristic about the way Jews have studied the law through...
I'd like to do a quick introduction to Carol. She is an advocate. She took Silk in 2021, and she's a senior official in the Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, which she was, and oversaw the development and implementation of the ANC's arts and culture policies. Very interesting person to chat to.
Millennia is that it's been about debate and argument and questioning. And you see rabbis from different centuries disagreeing with each other about the same text. And that is encouraged. That tradition of looking at a law or a rule and interrogating it and being encouraged to formulate your view on it, a reasoned view on it, one finds in any regular Jewish household. One finds argument. There's something in not only the tradition of law and justice, which is very deep, but in the very way in which Jews explore it. If you combine the history of interrogating the law with an intellectual history, you begin to understand why so many Jews were prominent lawyers and are prominent lawyers in South African society. There were Jews like Solian Albee Sachs and Izzy Maisels and Arthur Chaskelson and many others who said, we can't let happen to other people what's happened to us. I think for them, that sense of injustice was perhaps personal. It's some explanation as to why one sees so many of the prominent constitution makers and human rights lawyers being Jewish. But we mustn't mistake that. It doesn't mean that most Jewish lawyers were human rights lawyers. Most Jewish lawyers were not human rights lawyers. But among human rights lawyers, there was a huge proportion of Jewish lawyers.
Well, I really hope you all enjoyed that. It was quite condensed. There was so much information to share, but really enlightening.
Mark, it's extraordinary. And to see Alan popping up here and there with the appropriate pictures behind him and videos. It's extraordinary. It's also wonderful that we've got Hazel Frankel here with us, who was on the program talking about Yiddish. And we've got Chaim Rosenberg, who was a student of Philip Tobias. And I hope that they would like to say something, make a comment. So, Hazel, may we ask you to unmute and come in first to say a few words? Yes, you ready? Oh dear. It says you're unmuted, but we can't hear you at the moment. Okay. So maybe if we go to Chaim Rosenberg, would you like to talk about being a student of Philip Tobias and also the extraordinary number of Jewish teachers in the medical school that you came across?
Thank you, Geraldine. It's really fun to be here. It's 5 o'clock and after 5 o'clock in the morning, but the program seems so interesting that I thought I'd listen to it, and I must compliment the people who arranged this. It really is a picture of Jewish intellectualism. A few years ago, Geraldine and I got involved in telling the story of my medical school class, the class of 1960 at this, and this class was filled with very bright people, many of whom immigrated to Israel, England, the United States, Australia, and followed distinguished careers there. So
I really hope you all enjoyed that. It was quite condensed. There was so much information to share, but really enlightening.
Mark, it's extraordinary. And to see Alan popping up here and there with the appropriate pictures behind him and videos, it's extraordinary. It's also wonderful that we've got Hazel Frankel here with us, who was on the program talking about Yiddish. And we've got Chaim Rosenberg, who was a student of Philip Tobias. And I hope that they would like to say something, make a comment. So, Hazel, may we ask you to unmute and come in first to say a few words? Yes, you ready? Oh dear. It says you're unmuted, but we can't hear you at the moment. Okay. So maybe if we go to Chaim Rosenberg, would you like to talk about being a student of Philip Tobias and also the extraordinary number of Jewish teachers in the medical school that you came across?
thank you, Geraldine. It's really fun to be here. It's 5 o'clock and after 5 o'clock in the morning, but the program seems so interesting that I thought I'd listen to it, and I must compliment the people who arranged this. It really is a picture of Jewish intellectualism. A few years ago, Geraldine and I got involved in telling the story of my medical school class, the class of 1960 at this, and this class was filled with very bright people, many of whom immigrated to Israel, England, the United States, Australia, and followed distinguished careers there. So my great interest in this is that I happen to have just finished a book about the American experience, which is parallel in a sense with the one in South Africa, except it's a population of many times larger. And I think it's important not only to focus on the doctors and lawyers and academics, but there were Jewish sportsmen, there were Jewish actors, there were Jewish writers, at least in the United States, and they made a tremendous contribution, Jewish entrepreneurs. So I think the story is larger than doctors, lawyers, and academics, and I think it should be told in the South African context. So it is a great story, and my sort of sense it is this incredible migration of 4-5 million, no, 2-3 million Russian Jews from the Pale of Settlements who left between 1881 and 1914. Most went to the United States, some went to England, some went to Australia, Some went to South Africa, mainly Litvaks, but they went all over and they repeated the same story of achievement in the context of whatever lifestyle they found where they were. In South Africa, of course, it was associated with the black-white struggle and apartheid, but in the United States, it was broader with Yiddish theater, with Yiddish writing. And it's a great story, and I'm so interested that you presented this one from a South African perspective. And I hope we can join forces and look at the Great Migration in a broader sense that happened in other countries as well. Thank you, Geraldine.
Thanks, Mike.
If
Yes.
I can just make a mention, the next episode is actually about the people who are in the arts.
Okay.
So it was artists and dancers and theatre people and singers and film producers. So that also becomes a very interesting series about that, and also an incredible amount of things to learn about the community that in many ways I didn't know. And then, as I mentioned before, I think without Alan doing absolutely sterling work that he did on this production, I doubt whether it would ever see the light of day. But I agree with you that every single community around the world who has an involvement of Jews, they've invariably been very, very successful. And on a very kind of a sidebar, my wife's father's family came to Southern Africa from Rhodes Island in Greece. So they were Sephardis who were expelled from Spain in the 15th century, went to Turkey and Greece. Greece was under Italian occupation during World War II. And of course, it was invaded by the Black Shirts and then the Nazis. So there are incredible stories about the Sephardi community in itself. And I know that an American author, Michael Frank, has written a very interesting book called 100 Saturdays about that community. And it's fascinating. He's a New Yorker, and the lady who he interviews, I think she lives between Italy and New York.
Well,
Thanks, Mark. I also, just want to iterate that there are 8 episodes. We're just showing you some snippets of some of them. So Legends and Legacies has got 8 episodes, which I'm sure you can.
My sort of sense, very quickly, is that these immigrant people and the children of immigrants expressed their individual skills in whatever field that they were expert in. So they could be lawyers, they could be doctors, they could be business people, they could be athletes. It is a wide range of activities, and I look forward to seeing the other chapters of this saga. Thank you.
Thanks. Dave Bloom, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks, Geraldine. I don't know if you can see me.
We can see you and hear you.
Okay. So just a couple of comments from a Zimbabwe perspective, because we are part of this community. And I just want to mention 2 things that's probably not well known. There was a Yiddish theater in Bulawayo for a number of years in the 40s and 50s. I don't know much about it, but I've got pictures on the ZJC website, and it was quite an active group that ran Yiddish theater, quite unusual, I think, in the scheme of things. The other comment I want to make is about an export from Cape Town of Professor Michael Gelfand. Michael Gelfand was born in Cape Town, and he moved. He married a woman from Bulawayo and moved to Zimbabwe, Rhodesia at the time. Had an illustrious career in medicine. Eventually became the dean of the School of Medicine at the University of Rhodesia. And he wrote 34 books, and his speciality was on, especially on indigenous medicine. He studied the work of witch doctors, and was world renowned in the area of African medicine. Although he studied and he of course taught Western medicine, he was an absolute expert on the whole field of African medicine. He was at his funeral, Robert Mugabe, the famous and whatever you want to call him. Robert Mugabe was at Michael's funeral out of respect for the work that he did for helping the medical community and the and promoting the knowledge of African medicine in Zimbabwe. That's what I wanted to say.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. And Gail, you'd like to say something?
Yes, first of all, I'd just like to say thanks so much, Mark. That was really lovely. And it was very interesting to see these people who've achieved so much in the whole development of education and the status it had in our community. And then I just wanted to say that there are a few people here who really are expert, like Veronica. I know you on Yiddish, and maybe you'd like to say something about your work or make a comment. And also I'm reading here that Hazel Frankel said, it's inspiring to watch and listen to these achievements. Thank you. By the way, my book on David Fram has been subsequently published by Legenda, who focus on Yiddish history and culture. Thanks, Hazel. And then thanks also for these lovely comments, you know, that people have made, and I can see enjoyed this episode so much. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure. Here's Veronica. Okay.
I just sometimes feel, you know, when I make comments about Yiddish, obviously I've got in-depth knowledge, and sometimes, but nobody really else has. So sometimes I feel it's quite marginal. But Mark, I'm not sure if I heard correctly, but I think that when you mentioned the first Yiddish novel by Jacob Max Sherman, I think you might have lumped him together with his nephew. Jacob Max wrote the first novel called A Land von Gold und Sonnenschein, A Land of Gold and Sunshine. And it was his nephew who subsequently became a fellow at Oxford. So I'm not sure if the two were lumped together or not. The nephew was Joseph Sherman. And it's really thanks to Joseph Sherman that we know anything. And his book is called From a Land Far Off. And he's taken stories from all the Yiddish authors, South African authors, and introduced it. And if not for Joseph Sherman, who very sadly died at the age of 65, which is no age today, that we really have some insight into South African Yiddish. I myself, at the moment, I am involved I have a book in press in America, and it's a Holocaust memoir that was published in 1949 in Munich in the DP camps by somebody in Johannesburg called Levi Shalit, who was brought out to South Africa to edit what was the last Yiddish newspaper called the Afrikaner Iddische Zeitung. And this book will appear it's called So We Died, Life and Death in the Ghetto in Shawalai, which is in Lithuania. We know it better as Shovel. And that's the most recent thing that my most recent work that's in press. Oh, and somebody spoke about Rhodesia and Yiddish theater in Rhodesia. Again, nobody would know about this, but the couple who were very active there was a couple that was by the name of Mark Markov and Etta Topol, and they were brought out to South Africa in 1950 by somebody called Sarah Sylvia, who really is the main person as far as Yiddish theater in South Africa is concerned. And this couple, they didn't stay in South Africa. She also brought somebody called Chaila Rosenthal. Chaila did stay in South Africa. Mark Markov and Etta Topol went to Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was then. But I just feel that, as I said, a lot of this Yiddish is really, it's not well known at all. But yeah, as you did ask me, that is what I'm involved in.
Thanks so much, Veronica. I've got Joseph Sherman's book, From a Land Far Off. What it gives you is such an insight into South Africa from the eyes of a Lithuanian immigrant. And it's such a different and interesting perspective. So try and get it, from Aid Books or something. It's a wonderful a wonderful read, and I'm hoping that he wrote more stories or translated more stories for I don't know if those can be published any more of the translations.
Maybe
Also,
Hazel
he's-
Frankel has some thoughts. I don't know if she's still online.
We couldn't hear her. Is Hazel available? Are you?
I
Did you
see
still
that I see that she's just posted a picture of the book that she wrote. There's the cover over there, Holocaust and Home. So maybe there's a problem with her actually speaking. In addition, I see that there's something that Margaret Green said to everybody, that she was at Wits for a couple of years to do a BSc honors in physiology, and the medical students she was studying with insisted she go to Tobias's lectures. He was funny, entertaining, and opened the whole world of paleo anatomy for us in a very unique way. And that, I just wanted to say, as a doctor, and my father having been a doctor and qualified at Wits in 1948, and my aunt as a physiotherapist in 1948, Hazel, at Wits, you know, the amazing legacy that we were given as kids of these doctors and as students of these people who were fearless, really. That, I think for me now, at my stage in life, I'd say that that's really what characterized their fearless, explorative, you know, knowledge, education, looking for how to change things, help people. And there is a web exhibition that I put together of 20 just normal general practitioners. It's on the Kaplan website. And these were the doctors who held the communities together in terms of health. So there was a fabulous tradition there, no doubt. My son, the Jewish doctor, yeah.
That's wonderful. And, you know, in this project of the 1960 graduates, Philip Tobias had just come back from his studies in America and the UK, and was amazing. And we have testimonies of so many of his students, and also a very nice appreciation of Tobias. And I've just put on the chat the actual, you know, if you go to the whole website, under memoirs, you'll see the class of 60, and you can go there. What students have said is that it opened their minds to become a scientist and a researcher and to question. And there are 2 students in this year who were called Tobias's angels, because he used to take them on these field trips and open their minds. They used to dig for fossils, and he used to declaim at the campfires every night. You know, he would hold court, and so many generations of doctors are inspired by him and some of his colleagues. And there were other wonderful teachers that they mentioned. Harry Seftel, who just died recently, Professor Harry Seftel, Professor Leo Shamroth, Mosey Suzman, a physician at the Jewish Gen, who was Helen Suzman's husband. You know, you could read on that website just this one snapshot of the 1960s graduates, for whom there were 20 professors at different colleges, 3 deans of medical schools, just out of this one class of 100 graduates of medicine, over half of whom were Jewish.
So, the 2 angels were, of course, were Laurie Geffen and Bobrow, and Martin Bobrow, who I mean, contacted with Geffen, who lives in Queensland and was the dean of the medical school in Queensland, and also the dean of the medical school in Adelaide. And at this very moment, I think these 2 guys are meeting in Tasmania, because the Bobrows have come on a vacation to Australia to be with the Geffens, who are the very best friends. So this legacy of the class of 1960, excuse me, goes on for 65 years and more.
Fantastic. Right, does anybody else who'd like to make any comments before we close? And we mentioned that next week, as Marcus said, we're going on to the the artists, dancers, singers, or whatever.
I think there are two little people are writing in chat because maybe some of them don't want to comment, but there's some very interesting, there's a link that Dave Bloom has put to Gelfand, I see. And then Jean Zeidel said that Professor Sam Israelstam was a professor of chemistry and her uncle. And then Laura asks if it's still possible to see the whole series.
And I answered that question about it. The series is on Amazon Prime Video, but only to Africa, which is quite sad. It was only the licensing agreement they would do. But the series is available on a pay-per-view Vimeo channel. I think it's $9 or $10 to view the entire series. And I don't know if you can post those links somewhere, Gail, so people can pick them up. But it's titled Legends and Legacies. Sorry, Geraldine?
Yeah, if you send us the details, we'll circulate it to the group.
Okay, great. I'll do that.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody who's come on the thing and to everybody who's posted a message or spoken, and particularly to Mark. And please convey our thanks to Alan, who's on his back in pain, for his amazing, fluent this exposition of this amazing story. So thank you very much. Next week, we're back at the same later time. So the Australians, you can set your alarm and get up early or stay up late or whatever it happens to be. And watch out because, for instance, the UK times are different in relation to South African times because we're moving forward to British summertime this weekend. So just make sure you know what time you're supposed to be tuning in for. Mark, we look forward to seeing you again next week and see everybody. And thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, Geraldine, and thanks, Gail. It's been such a great opportunity, and you can see I've enjoyed every moment of it.
I can see. That's nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.